Major funding for these programs has been provided by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and M&T Bank, Geneva Burns, Giantomasi and Webster, Capital One Bank, the Witkoff Group, New York Community Bank, Greenberg Traurig, Perfect Building Maintenance, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by grants from Ariel Property Advisors, AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Colliers International NYC, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, CUNY TV Foundation, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, First Nationwide Title Insurance Agency, Flushing Bank, Friedman, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Herrick Feinstein, Hersha Hospitality Trust, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman, USRealty.com, John Katsimides, Red Apple Group, Margolin Weiner and Evans, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, New Banks, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, People's United Bank, RBS Citizens Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, Urban American, and these friends.
Here you are, there are companies in second, third, fourth generation businesses. How do they grow? How do they prosper in the 21st century? How do they interact with their relatives? How is a business growing? It's a tough subject. I'm not from that. But today I've assembled a group who've been involved with the third and their fourth generation. Possibly, if we go back with Mr. Neuman's relatives, they could be in the fifth generation. So my guest come from all different areas. My guest is Richard Mack, who's the CEO of the Mack Real Estate Group, third generation. Lawrence Benenson, who is a partner at Benenson Capital Partners, third generation. Marc Mathios, who is the COO at Ace Apparel, third generation. Paul Neuman, who is the chief creative innovator at Newman's Kitchen, fourth or fifth generation. And last but not least, Bruce Bozzi Jr., the executive vice president of the famous Palm Restaurant Group, fourth generation. We were talking prior to the show, your grandfather, Bert, was the first generation. Your father went into the business really as the second generation. He then sold that business with him. They merged it into Mack, and he went on to a large private equity. And now you've gone back into business with your father. How do you feel that it is to work from generation to generation?
So, Michael, the first thing that I would say is that a family business is about more than making money. And so if you're going to make a decision to be in a family business, you have to understand that the business has to have other priorities. Now, if you are in the business of managing other people's money, you have to take that fiduciary obligation very seriously, and that has to be your absolute priority. But as the owner of the business, family businesses have other priorities than just the making of money, and I think that's a very important distinction to make about family businesses. I think the second thing that I would say just about the introduction is that our family business has evolved dramatically. My grandfather was really not a real estate guy. He had one or two buildings that were tangential to his business. my father saw the opportunity in real estate and expanded it.
Right, he went into the Meadowlands and went into the office industrial buildings and the office buildings, and then they sold.
That's correct. And he had his 3 brothers with him. And they sold a large part of the business, but retained a very substantial part of the business that they still own as partners together. And that allowed my father to do something else, which really wasn't a family business. And while I was a partner, there were many other partners in that business. When we had the opportunity to sell that business, which was really a professional business, and go back in business together, we brought my brother in, and we knew we were going back into a family business model, and we understood that our priorities as a family business were going to be different than they were in a partnership with primarily non-family members.
You know, we were talking prior to the show to the adaptability, okay? And, you know, Marc, it was your grandfather, Morris, who came over from Greece, and he went into one business. Then your father joined him, and he expanded the business a little bit, okay? And now you and your brothers are the 3rd generation, and you've expanded it to a totally different thing. So it really relates to adaptability and what you do with the business. How hard is it to work with relatives within a business?
Michael, I have my dad, who's still very heavily involved in the business, and then I work with my 2 brothers. It's great to have 2 brothers and your father in business with you, because you know that you can rely upon them. They have the family business's interests first and foremost. It's not like an employee being left to run the business while you're away. So in that regard, it's wonderful, and it's great going to work and building something that you know your grandfather was in the same room that I was in. It's a great feeling. But the family dynamics of 3 brothers growing up within 4 years come across as well. You know, I'm born first. I have 2 younger brothers. Some of the dynamics of my relationship with my brothers growing up come back into the business. The way I speak with them can be viewed as Marc's the older brother, and he's speaking to me like he used to when I was a little kid. And that is a struggle.
Now, what's interesting, you know, I'm going to go to Lawrence right now, because Lawrence has 2 half-brothers.
Yes, sir.
Okay, who are older than you, substantially older, who really were never involved in the real estate business, which is the business of Benenson, you know, that your grandfather started. How do they relate? I mean, because the success, you know, this success, as Richard said, there's different type of success. There's a financial success, and there's a success for families to survive and grow, okay? Financial success, sometimes you have to make sure that you work and adapt, as we'll get to you in a second with you know, your father's partner over there. How does it work with them? Because they really weren't involved with the business.
Well, I like to think of myself as the 3rd and a half generation, because I am so much younger than they are. They're actually 21 and 24 years older, and we did not grow up together. And it's very difficult, because they always looked at me as the little baby, and I hope they don't anymore. But it's challenging to speak with them. My brother Bill lives in California. My brother Fred lives in New York. And I'm actually much closer with their children. And
so, but that relates. Do you see perhaps their children entering the business?
it's possible. It's possible. My nephew Stephen owns some real estate by himself in Maine and loves it. I do not have children yet. I hope to. I think that we're sticking together, even though we have some different values and different ways of doing business. We're sticking together because this golden goose is so golden.
See, but your business is an asset that potentially grows in the way the economy grows. It helps, okay? You know, we may have ups and downs. Now, let's go to Paul, which really goes back to your great-grandfather or even further, which we're not sure of what generation, you know, that they came over.
Michael, I think of myself more as extending a family tradition.
That's
family
exactly what
business.
your father, when you were working with your father
Mm-hmm.
at the fish market, that was working with a family business.
That's right.
Okay, but then you've changed that because you then
Right.
went into you've stayed in the food service business.
Well, you talk about how to businesses adapt and change, and I would probably be an example of how families adapt and change within a business. So while my great-grandfather was a chef and an owner of restaurants back at the turn of the 20th century, and my grandfather started a fish market because he couldn't get along with his brothers in the meat business in 1906. He passed away in 1937. My father took over just before World War II and ran it until he passed away in 2001. I'm in the food business, which is what my family's been in, but my business is very different than the business I grew up in.
But you
and the
adapt,
business-
as I said.
Adapted. It's all about
But
adapting.
the point is, when your father died in 2001, you weren't in the business.
No.
You were in the food business with your dad at the beginning.
Right.
You then went into the purveyor. You had a store. You were a food
Well,
merchant.
you know, you talk about what do you carry forward and what do you leave behind. Some of the most powerful lessons are the way I don't want to conduct business, the things I learned from my dad that I assumed he learned from his dad. What I try to bring to work every day is a sort of tradition of excellence and a tradition of caring for the client. That was something my father excelled at. There's a lot of things my dad did that I've moved away from. I've told you my dad was like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. All he wanted to do was unlock the fish market and repeat whatever he had done the day before, the week before, the month before, and 20 years before. That is a formula for going out of business. So I learned
And
that
that's
early.
why the statistics that I brought up prior to the show, is that second generations sometimes survive. Third generations have like a 13% success rate, and fourth generations have a 2% success
Right.
rate. Fourth generation, getting to you. I mean,
Yep.
your great grandfather and his partner open up this little place on 2nd Avenue. Then your grandfather goes into business, and then your father goes into the business because your grandfather got sick. Right?
Yeah, my father and his partner Wally, the third generation. The interesting thing with the Palm is the first two were very content with the one store on 2nd Avenue, and that was
And the one store, okay?
the one store, 837,
Without the addition.
with no addition, and that was successful, and it was providing their families with their livelihoods. And when my father and his partner decided to start to expand the Palm, it was to the dismay of their fathers. They didn't understand it. They didn't want it. And they basically said when they were going to Washington, this is your thing. So the third generation at the Palm, the reason the Palm is still here and the reason the Palm, I really believe, is the Palm and has sustained what it is and grew is because of the third generation, where they hit the road. Wally was a pioneer. Wally Gansey is the son of Walter Gansey and the grandson of John Gansey. He hit the road for whatever reasons that brought him to each city. Without him going to each city culturally, this sort of phenomena I think couldn't have been passed. Where my father stayed in New York, and that was the
But Wally's alive, and your father is alive.
Yes.
Okay, and you're in the business today. Now, the good part that we prior discussed that Richard didn't initially go into his father's business over there in that situation. You were working for someone else. You were working in public accounting. Him, we forget. This was, and you yourself, really, you may have worked when you were 19 in the restaurant, but you went out, you wanted to be in
I did not want to go into the restaurant business. I saw how difficult it was. I saw that I never saw my dad. My father, Monday through Friday, did not exist at home. When I went to school, he was sleeping. When I came home, he was at work. My mother raised us. I saw him Saturdays, extremely exhausted.
You were lucky to see him on
On
Saturdays.
Saturdays.
It's a business.
But just in the afternoon, and on Sundays we had family dinner. So there was, as I started in my teens and 18, I was going no place near the restaurant business.
But you see, that probably relates well to Paul. The same
Oh, I never saw my
situation.
dad.
You never saw your dad. Your dad was 6 days a week in the fish market.
And the seventh day did the books. I mean, literally, he worked, he went to the market 3:30, 4 a.m., worked till 6 o'clock at night, came home, never saw him in the morning,
Right.
had dinner together for 15 minutes. Saturdays he worked a full day, and Sundays he went in the basement and, you know, did the books. So it was really, he was around, but it's very, and I had the same impression, which is, do I really want to work this hard?
Because I think in the family business, you know, the responsibility that you have for the people that you work with is so profound, and my family and the Ganzi family has always taken that so seriously. We know now there's about 1,500 employees, but we are responsible for them, for their health insurance, for their kids going to school, for so many different pieces that we take that so seriously, I think, and that's why these guys were working their butts off. They just were in it. And though the fourth generation, so I was challenged with coming in, and though I'd been working close to 20 years in 2006, 2007, in this sort of 2008, the horror time of the economy, how do we keep a brand like the Palm?
But you know, that relates. I mean, there are real estate families, okay? You know, and as you said, your grandfather originally was more involved with renovations, demolition of buildings. I mean, he demolished the old Coliseum and every other thing. Then they expanded over there. Do you remember your grandfather?
Very well.
Okay. Do you remember seeing your grandfather and your father in the real estate business?
You know, I remember the dinner table conversations being full of business. My grandfather staked his second eldest son to do a crazy idea, which was to build distribution facilities in the swamps in New Jersey. It seems like a pretty good idea today, but that was a big risk. And I remember growing up with conversation at the dinner table about the business and where it was going, and the three brothers who all had different roles in the business. I remember spending my weekends with my father at construction sites. So the DNA of the business, of the real estate business, was passed on to me. I also saw the problems that relatives had working together. With four brothers in the business was not an easy thing. And so my goal was to be in the real estate business and not to be in a family business. And in 1993, when my father, who was moving away from business with his brothers, approached me about starting a real estate fund business and being the third employee, it was with great reticence that I decided to do that. But my decision was that this was a tremendous opportunity, maybe a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We would invest capital that was raised in a fund format, which had really not been done before, into a depressed market. We would buy those assets, sell those assets, liquidate the fund, and we'd probably both go our separate ways, because who knew that there was such a thing as the real estate private equity business? And so over the next 20 years, the business evolved, and what became clear was that we were not in a family business, and part of what I enjoyed was spending time with my father at the office, which I never thought I would. And so when we sold the business and I had the opportunity to create a family business and be in a luxury of doing that, of being in business with my dad and bringing my brother in and spending time every day with the people that I care about the most, I mean, that was a tremendous opportunity for me. And I think that you know, we've lost some things in the transition to the family office, but the gain has been far greater than the losses.
At one time, we were talking about your son Max, who was with Goldman. He had that thought of maybe getting involved with a food service type of involvement. Do you see? I mean, right now you don't have any children, but you have cousins over there. Do you see them getting into the business? And how hard is it for that next generation to get into that business?
Well, I mean, I have a nephew who's in his early 20s the restaurant business is in his DNA, and I do think that's, you know, to your earlier point, when you go into a family business, it's about the love of the business. It's about growing up. It's not about making the money, which is part of business. It's in you. So yes, but I think our business has changed so much that to go into the restaurant business in a company that has 27 restaurants, the economics are so difficult that I feel as we go into 87, 88 years, to be a 100-year-old restaurant company, it's probably slim. I mean, we don't have the the intention. That's not on the table. But we deal most of our days now dealing with HR issues and energy issues and food cost issues that are so profound that just sort of are now not necessarily about dealing with, I'm coming in and the
But you know,
hospitality issue.
Richard, prior to the show, brought up a very interesting situation. You know, New York City was the home of apparel manufacturing. And you know, that was a business that many people had the generations going into it. You know, that was, you were told you were going to go into that business. There was no question about it, okay? You were part of that business. And look what has happened to that business. Part of it relates to the change of the economies and the manufacturing over there. But that was, you know, this was the responsibility that you would go into that business, like it or not. And, you know.
Well, you know, I think there's two things. There's happy business, happy family. Happy business, happy children. If your child is going to go into your business and be unhappy, that's a formula for losing both things. So the best thing in my case is for me to bless Max's route to whatever life he wants, and at the same time assure that the business survives with either, you know, to make sure the business survives, and that's what we're working on now.
You know, it's interesting. My late father-in-law, my first father-in-law, he had a drugstore in Borough Park, and he had his son in the business, which was the second generation. Basically, he lost the business, but my sons, part of their responsibility, like you went with your father, they went with their grandfather to the drugstore, and they would no way, even if there was a financial to make money, they hated this. This would be the last thing that they would have in their mind to ever go into over there. Now, what about you? Since you were the younger brother, okay, did you have any reticence to go into this business?
It's an interesting question. I actually felt it incumbent upon me to go into the business because my father had two sons who were not in the business. One became a filmmaker, one was a doctor of philosophy, and I think that it's interesting to hear what Paul said. My father was 54 when I was born, and he seemed to decide to pay a lot more attention to me than he had in his previous marriage, to his children, his previous marriage. And I was just fascinated that he was telling me these stories about, we own the Willard Hotel in Washington, and he actually sued the United States government in a landmark case that he told the lawyer what strategy to use, which was reverse condemnation, because the government wouldn't let him develop or renovate the Willard Hotel because of Pennsylvania Avenue Commission. But I was just fascinated by his stories, and I read the books when I was little that said, you know, the son goes into the family business, and I went into the family business, and there was never really a question about it.
Here's an interesting thing. Paul Neuman knows one of my good friends, Paul Rich, whose specialty is succession planning. It's a very difficult thing, and we were talking about this before. You know, sometimes you need that outside person, that outside mind, to give you a point of view. You know, it's like the psychiatrist of running a family business, because that's what you need.
The succession conversation has been going on in my family for so long. Finally, you know, you just have to embrace one's mortality, which I think there was that whole issue of just not wanting to understand that. But what does it look like? Because traditionally, it was the older sons went in, the women were not a part of the business. They were in a part of it in a different way. So now that they inherited one restaurant, so now it's a whole different ball game. So it's very complicated. You do need that outside person who can look in and kind of guide it, because emotionally.
Paul?
Well, my dad literally, I mean, he tried to die with his boots on. One of my dad's famous stories was there was a dealer in the wholesale market who sold halibut and swordfish. His name was Artie Behrens. And Dad came home one night and said, Artie Behrens died in the market. They laid him out on the top of a halibut box. I mean, this was like mythical, you know. This was Dad's, oh my God, he died in the market, died with his boots on. They laid him out on the top of a halibut box. This was like Dad's dream. No, I'm serious.
What a way to go.
It turned Artie Behrens into this mythical character who would survive the generations of the stories of the Fulton Fish Market. So what did I learn from my dad, who took the business with him, is if you want to take the business with him, stay at the dance too long, right? If you want the business to survive, whether you're handing it to kids or not, figure out when you've been there
Okay,
long
but I think, see, what Richard said before, that Grandpa Bert helped stake his father in this swamplands where Jimmy Hoffa might have been buried. Okay, okay.
Probably was in the
Okay.
He's
that
in a
spot.
distribution center now.
Right, yeah.
He's
in the concrete
He's
someplace.
in the
Yeah,
concrete
yeah.
somewhere over there. But that was saying, hey, I'll give you an opportunity, but adapt, okay? Which was the same. I mean, your father probably would have been very happy if you said, Pop, I'm going to come in today. I'm going to be behind you in the fish market. I'll go to the fish market there every day.
It's interesting because he would have been happy if I worked behind him and never got in his way and never did anything innovative or never made space for myself.
Right.
So
just be there.
just be there.
Okay,
and then when I die, maybe if you're lucky, but it obviously doesn't work out.
No. But here's the interesting situation. Your father, or maybe their sons, I don't know if it's true, your father followed his father in business, really adapting it slightly, okay? You've expanded it really into a different thing. Part of it's because the business changed, relating to the apparel business before, because you were in the drop cloth business, you were in the paint supply, making for that. Now you're in the branded apparel business. But that's partially because the business had to change.
The business certainly had to change. We talked about how textiles, that whole dynamic in America has changed. In fact, in as late as the 1990s, 2 out of every 100 Americans were working somewhere in the textile business, whether it was in the weaving side, manufacturing the cloth, or cutting and sewing, which is a phenomenal number as a percentage, 2 out of 100 working in that business. Now it's less than 1%. But the point is that we did have to change as a result of Asian influences in the textile business. But what we did do is we did adapt and we did change, but we stayed within our core capacities: manufacturing, printing of shirts, embroidering of products, all things that are not as susceptible to imports, but within our basic skill set.
But I think the lessons that I'm hearing, that come out of this is that everyone, if you're going to get involved with some potential family or generation business, the best thing is really not go and get a job somewhere else upon graduation from college, to learn something, to gain some skills, to see the world, to have a better exposure of it. That's one situation. The second thing is be open to having somebody who's independent to provide some insight in helping you grow. Because sometimes, you live in this small world that you don't have enough people helping you to understand where you can grow.
Beyond getting perspective that you can bring back from some different experience, also it's about respecting the job as well, respecting the fact that you're in a business that is a family business that's there to support you, but respect the fact that you had a boss somewhere else, and you know what it's like to work for somebody,
Right.
as opposed to being your own boss.
So 30 minutes have come and gone, and I really think we've got a lot out of it today, and I'd like to thank Richard, Lawrence, Marc, Paul, and Bruce, and I'll see you next week.